There are places you visit because you're curious, and then there are places like this, where curiosity feels like a mistake the moment you step inside. The building loomed ahead of me like a wounded giant, its shattered windows reflecting the weak glow of my flashlight. Rain pounded against the cracked stone walls of Blackwood Asylum, once home to some of the most enigmatic and haunting patients ever recorded. Among them were the silent twins. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my breath fogging in the cold night air as I approached the rusted entrance doors. The stories about these twins, June and Emily, had consumed me for years. They spoke only to each other, crafting their own language, and their bond was so intense it seemed to exist in a world no one else could access. The locals in town warned me against coming here. They said the twins' presence still lingered in the asylum, whispering secrets through the cracks in the walls, but I couldn't resist. As a freelance journalist obsessed with forgotten stories, this was the kind of tale I lived for. I pushed the heavy door open, its screech echoing through the decaying halls. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else. Something sour, something old. My flashlight swept across faded murals of cheerful flowers on peeling walls, twisted irony for a place where so much suffering had occurred. The sound of dripping water followed me as I walked deeper inside, past broken gurneys and scattered papers. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling into itself. I reached what looked like the administrative office. A sign hung crookedly above the door, "Patient Records." It felt like a good place to start. Pushing the door open, I was greeted by a chaotic mess. Drawers pulled out, paper scattered across the floor, and shattered glass glinting in the flashlight's beam. As I sifted through the mess, something caught my eye. A small, leather-bound journal wedged between two filing cabinets. Its edges were worn, and the cover was stained with what looked like rust, or perhaps something darker. I knelt down, carefully pulling it free. My hands trembled slightly as I turned it over and read the name scrawled in faded ink on the cover. Emily. I swallowed hard and flipped it open. The handwriting inside was erratic, sometimes rushed and illegible, other times painfully neat, almost obsessive. Strange symbols filled the margins, and words repeated over and over. "We must stay together. We must stay together." The drawings were worse, faces with hollow eyes, figures standing in dark doorways, hands reaching out of shadows. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I turned each page, my flashlight flickering slightly as if reacting to the words themselves. But one entry, dated a few days before the asylum closed, stood out. She said I have to stay quiet. She said if I speak, it will find me. The silence keeps us safe, but I hear it scratching now, at the walls, at my mind. It wants one of us to leave, and one of us to stay. We made a promise, but promises break, don't they? A sudden noise, like a faint whisper, cut through the silence. My head snapped up and I froze, holding my breath. It came from somewhere deeper in the building. I stuffed the journal into my bag, rose to my feet, and backed out of the office, my flashlight beam trembling slightly as I pointed it down the hallway. "Calm down, Alex," I whispered to myself. "It's just the wind, just an old building settling." But as I turned to head back, I could have sworn I heard it again. Softer this time, almost playful. A whisper, a laugh. If you love stories like this, dark, mysterious, and real, don't forget to hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. I had come here for answers, but I was starting to realize I might leave with something far worse. With the journal clutched tightly in my bag, I pressed forward into the shadows of Blackwood Asylum. The backstory of the silent twins. I found a room that felt less hostile. It was small, with a narrow window half covered by rotting curtains, allowing just enough moonlight to paint pale streaks across the cracked floor. I set my flashlight down on an overturned crate, its beam casting long shadows on the stained walls. Carefully, I pulled the journal from my bag and flipped it open again, my fingertips grazing the warped edges of the pages. Emily's words weren't just scribbles, they felt like desperate whispers trapped on paper, clinging to whoever dared to read them. The silent twins, Emily and June, were born into a quiet countryside family. They weren't always silent, though. As toddlers, they babbled and laughed like any other children. But around the age of 5, something shifted. Their parents noticed they began speaking only to each other in a strange, melodic language no one else could understand. Doctors labeled it cryptophasia, a phenomenon where twins create a private language. But this wasn't just playful gibberish. It was complex, intricate, almost ritualistic. The journal mentioned their parents growing frustrated, teachers growing afraid, and neighbors whispering cruel theories. The girls became more withdrawn, avoiding eye contact, reacting violently when separated. "They don't need anyone else," one teacher wrote in a note Emily had copied into her journal. "They live in a world of their own. They shut everyone out. It's unnatural." Despite their silence in public, Emily and June were brilliant writers. They filled dozens of notebooks with short stories, poetry, and vivid fantasies, worlds that existed only between them. Stories of dark forests, shadowy figures, and endless hallways that one twin would always fail to escape. But something in their bond became corrosive. The journal's handwriting turned sharper, more frantic, as Emily described their final days at home. "She looks at me like she knows something I don't, like she's seen something in the dark that I missed. We don't talk about the dream. The same dream, every night. The hallway, the door, the choice." Their parents, unable to cope with their erratic behavior and growing violence toward each other, made the difficult decision to commit them to Blackwood Asylum. The asylum staff tried separating them, thinking distance might break whatever unhealthy dependence they had, but it only made things worse. Emily stopped eating. June started screaming into her pillow at night, screams that couldn't escape the muffling fabric but still managed to echo through the halls. When reunited, they would sit together, unmoving, whispering their private language under their breath for hours. Nurses reported their lips moving in perfect synchronization, like two sides of the same broken mirror. There was one nurse, a kind woman named Meredith, who took a particular interest in the twins. Emily mentioned her in the journal several times. "Nurse Meredith says we don't belong here. She says we're too smart for this place, but I see it in her eyes when she comes into our room. She's scared of us too. She thinks we don't notice, but we do." Then came the rumors, the whispers among the asylum staff. They said no matter how many doors you closed between you and the twins, you could always hear them whispering. And it wasn't just incoherent murmurs, it was words, specific, deliberate words. "I hear them at night," one orderly reportedly said. "My shift ends on the 3rd floor, nowhere near their ward, but I hear them. My name, over and over, in their voices." As I turned the next page, something slipped out, a small Polaroid photograph, yellowed with age. It was the twins, sitting on the floor of their shared room. They looked gaunt, their pale faces shadowed by dark circles beneath their eyes. But it wasn't their faces that unnerved me, it was their posture. They were mirroring each other perfectly, legs crossed, hands folded, heads tilted at the exact same angle. And their eyes, they weren't looking at the camera, they were looking past it. I stared at the photo for a long time before tucking it back between the pages. Near the end of the journal, the handwriting deteriorated. Jagged, uneven lines like Emily had written them with a trembling hand. June says, "We made a mistake. The promise was broken. The shadows are here now, creeping closer every night. They want one of us to stay and one of us to leave. But we can't break apart. We can't. The final few pages were stained and smudged, as if they'd been clutched tightly by shaking hands. The silence isn't enough anymore. It's listening. It's always listening. I closed the journal and set it on the crate beside me, exhaling slowly. The faint sound of dripping water filled the silence, but it felt heavier now. The bond between Emily and June wasn't just a psychological dependence. It was something deeper, something far more sinister. I could feel it in the air around me, in the way shadows clung to the corners of the room, refusing to be chased away by my flickering flashlight. The twins were silent, yes, but silence isn't the same as peace. And somewhere in this building, their story wasn't finished. The air in the small room felt heavier now, almost as if it was pressing down on me. Emily's journal lay closed beside me, its secrets still vibrating in the back of my mind. I needed a break, a moment to clear my head. But something caught my eye. At the base of the old cabinet where I'd found the journal, there was a faint outline, a rectangle etched into the dust-covered floor. Instinctively, I crouched down and ran my fingers over the edges. It was subtle, almost hidden, but it was there. A loose floorboard. My breath hitched as I wedged my fingers into the thin gap and pulled. The wood creaked in protest before finally giving way. Beneath it, nestled in a small hollow, was an old cassette tape. The tape was labeled in shaky red ink. "Do not play." I stared at it for a long moment, my flashlight beam reflecting off its cracked plastic case. My rational mind screamed at me to put it back, to cover the hole and leave. But curiosity, the same impulse that had brought me to Blackwood Asylum, was louder. There was an old tape recorder on a nearby shelf, dusty and half covered in cobwebs. I picked it up, brushed it off, and clicked the tape into place. The silence in the room felt louder now, a suffocating hum that filled every inch of the space. I pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static, an uneven crackling sound that hissed and popped through the ancient speakers. I leaned closer, straining to hear anything beneath the noise. Then, faintly, I heard it. Whispers. Soft, overlapping whispers, like dozens of voices murmuring all at once. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but they were there, tangled together in a web of distorted sound. The whispers grew clearer, rising above the static in sharp bursts. A voice, female, soft but urgent, pushed through. "We must stay together. Stay together. Promise." My stomach tightened. It was Emily's voice, or maybe it was June's. I couldn't tell. The tape crackled again, and a new sound emerged, something faint, like fingernails scraping against wood. My eyes flickered to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. I felt the temperature drop. The flashlight began to flicker, the beam trembling as if it was struggling to stay alive. "It's here," the voice on the tape whispered. A loud thud came from behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. A metal filing cabinet had shifted slightly, scraping against the floor. My breathing grew ragged as I turned back to the recorder. The whispers had become erratic now, frantic, layered on top of one another in a cacophony of fear. "Alex." I froze. My name had just come through the speakers. Clear. Director. My hand hovered over the stop button, but I couldn't move. The voice repeated it again, soft this time, almost tender. "Alex, you shouldn't be here." The flashlight in my hand flickered again, and then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, and all I had was the sound of the tape, a rising storm of whispers and static, punctuated by sharp, uneven breathing. Something shifted in the shadows to my left, a faint, shuffling sound, like someone moving barefoot across the floor. "It's listening," the voice on the tape said. I felt a breath of cold air on the back of my neck. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "Don't turn around, Alex." I could hear it now, whispers in the room. They weren't coming from the recorder anymore. They were behind me. Slowly, with trembling hands, I reached out and pressed stop on the recorder. The whispers cut off instantly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sound, any movement. Then, from somewhere deep in the building, I heard it, a faint giggle. It echoed through the empty halls, bouncing off cracked walls and broken windows. A child's laugh. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. If you found a tape like this, would you play it, or would you walk away? The flashlight sputtered back to life, weak and flickering. I scanned the room quickly, my pulse hammering in my ears. Everything was still again. The cabinet, the floorboard, the journal. But it felt like the walls were holding their breath, like the shadows themselves were waiting for me to make a move. I grabbed the recorder and the tape, shoving them into my bag. Every instinct told me to leave, to run straight for the exit and never look back. But something deeper, some gnawing hunger for answers kept me rooted. The tape wasn't just a recording, it was a message, a warning. And whatever was waiting deeper in the asylum, it wasn't finished with me yet. I took a deep breath, steadied my shaking flashlight and stepped back into the hallway. The giggle echoed again, fainter this time, like a fading memory. I wasn't alone here, and whatever had spoken to me through the tape, whatever had whispered my name, was still watching. The hallway stretched out before me like the throat of some sleeping creature, dark and narrow, swallowing the light from my flickering flashlight. My footsteps echoed against the cracked tiles, each step feeling louder than it should have been, as if the building itself was listening. The tape recorder was shoved deep into my bag, but I could still feel it, like it was still alive, still whispering faint secrets through the worn-out plastic. I moved carefully, one hand gripping the flashlight, the other hovering near the bag strap as if it would keep me safe somehow. The air was colder here, and the mildew smell was replaced by something sharper, a scent I couldn't quite place, but it reminded me of rust and damp fabric. The ward ahead of me was labeled Patient Isolation Block 3 in faded, flaking letters above a warped wooden door. I pushed it open, and it let out a low, guttural groan as it swung inward. Inside, rows of tiny rooms lined either side of a narrow corridor. Heavy iron doors stood slightly ajar, like mouths frozen mid-scream. Each door had a small rectangular window, smeared and fogged from years of neglect. As I walked down the corridor, I felt it, the weight. The air felt heavy here, pressing against my chest with every step. Then I noticed something strange. On one of the iron doors, faint scratches marred the surface. Words had been etched into the metal over and over, with something sharp. Maybe a nail, maybe something else. We must stay together. We must stay together. We must stay together. The repetition made my skin crawl. I pushed open the door and stepped inside the room. It was small, barely enough space for a bed and a tiny desk bolted to the wall. The mattress had rotted away to springs, and paper fragments lay scattered across the floor. But on the desk, tucked carefully into a small metal box, were letters. I picked one up carefully. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, but the ink was still bold. Dear June, they say we can't be together anymore. They say we're dangerous, but they don't understand. They don't know about the promise. We made it, and we can't break it now. Emily. I sifted through the box, my hands trembling slightly. There were dozens of these letters, each one short, each one a desperate attempt to cling to something, to someone. Dear Emily, I hear you at night. They say I'm imagining it, but I know it's you. Are you in the walls? Are you in the air? June. The letters became more frantic as I read on. Their words were filled with dread, with fear, and with something else, something that felt final. She came last night, Emily, the shadow lady. She whispered to me. She said one of us can leave, but the other must stay. But we promised, didn't we? We promised to stay together. I froze, clutching the paper in my hand. The shadow lady. That same oppressive feeling washed over me again. The sense of being watched, of something just beyond my vision moving in the corners of the room. I placed the letters back in the box carefully and turned to leave. But something caught my eye in the far corner of the room. A mirror. It was cracked and stained, but it stood upright against the wall, its edges framed in rusting metal. For a moment, I saw nothing but my reflection, hollow-eyed, pale, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. But then, something moved behind me. A shape. Faint, shadowy, but there. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but the corner was empty. My breath came fast now, uneven, my pulse hammering in my ears. From somewhere deep in the asylum, I heard it again, that faint giggle. The same childlike laugh that seemed to bounce off every surface, making it impossible to pinpoint its origin. I backed out of the room, my shoulders bumping into the doorframe as I stumbled into the hallway. But the laughter, it followed me. I pressed on, moving deeper into the isolation ward. Each door I passed seemed to groan softly in the windless air, and faint whispers seemed to coil around my ears, slipping into the cracks of my sanity. Finally, at the very end of the corridor, there was a larger door, its surface scratched and dented, as if someone had been trying desperately to claw their way in. A small sign was nailed crookedly above it. Private, do not enter. But at this point, warnings felt hollow. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was a larger room, one that might have served as a common area or observation space, but what drew my attention was the wall across from me. It was covered in writing, layer after layer of scrawled words etched into the paint, overlapping and frantic. We must stay together. Don't open the door. The shadow lady is watching. She's in the silence. And in the very center of the wall, carved deeper than the rest, was one final phrase. One leaves, one stays. A gust of cold air swept through the room, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw movement in the reflection of the cracked glass window. A figure, small, thin, standing just behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. My hands shook as I backed away, my flashlight flickering again. The weight in the air was unbearable now, thick and suffocating. My skin felt electric, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for me to do something, to choose something. What happened here? I whispered aloud, my voice trembling. But the room gave me no answers, only silence. A silence so heavy, it felt alive. I needed to leave this ward. Now clutching the metal box of letters, I turned and hurried back down the corridor, the faint laughter still echoing somewhere just behind me. But even as I rushed toward the faint light filtering from the hallway I'd come from, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something patient, something hungry. I stumbled back into the small room where I'd first found Emily's journal, my flashlight barely clinging to life. My breathing was ragged, sharp bursts of air slicing through the silence. The box of letters was tucked under my arm, their weight far heavier than paper should feel. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, squeezing my eyes shut for a moment. The faint laughter I'd heard in the ward still echoed somewhere deep in my skull, like it had burrowed into the folds of my brain. The journal sat where I'd left it, lying open on the crate. Its worn pages glowed faintly under the flickering light. The box of letters felt like a puzzle piece that belonged to whatever final secret was etched into those last few pages. With trembling hands, I sat down, pulled the journal toward me, and flipped to the final entry. The ink was smeared in places, the handwriting frantic, desperate, almost violent. June says it's the only way. She says the shadow lady made her a deal. One stays, one leaves. But we promised we'd stay together. She keeps looking at me with those hollow eyes, like she already knows how this ends. The next line was pressed so hard into the page that the paper had nearly torn. But I hear it now, in the silence, the scratching, the whispering. It wants one of us. It's not asking anymore. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, ruffling the edges of the journal. My flashlight flickered, then went out entirely. Darkness swallowed me. No, 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 come on, I muttered, smacking the flashlight against my palm. The bulb buzzed weakly before sputtering back to life, casting pale light across the room. But something was off. The shadows in the corners felt thicker, like ink seeping into water. The air was colder now, sharp enough to sting my lungs. I forced myself to keep reading. She said if I stay quiet, it won't find me. If I stop breathing, stop moving, stop speaking, it won't notice me. But June, she spoke. And now it's here. It's in the room with us. The words were smudged after that, as if Emily's hand had been trembling uncontrollably. She broke the promise. She spoke to it. And now it's watching me. A sound cut through the silence. A faint scraping, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. I froze, clutching the journal tightly, my eyes darting toward the corner of the room. The shadows there, they weren't still. They were moving. Something shifted in the darkness, a faint outline, something impossibly thin and tall, its edges blurring like smoke. My chest tightened as a wave of dread washed over me. I could feel it watching me, even without eyes. The journal trembled in my hands as I turned to the very last page. I hear it breathing now, right behind me. If anyone reads this, if anyone finds this journal, run. Don't look, don't speak, just run. The final word was scratched so deeply into the paper that it had torn through to the back cover. And then, silence. A deep, suffocating silence. I couldn't move. My chest felt like it was caving in, and the air around me felt thick, oppressive, like something was pressing against my ribs. And then, slowly, I heard it. A whisper, right behind me. Alex. The voice was soft, lilting, like someone speaking through cracked glass. My flashlight flickered again, and my throat felt dry, locked in place by terror. You shouldn't be here. The crate beside me tipped over on its own, crashing loudly against the floor. I scrambled backward, clutching the journal to my chest as my flashlight swung wildly across the room. In the far corner, the shadows shifted. They unraveled like smoke being pulled by invisible threads, forming the faint outline of a figure, a girl, thin, with long tangled hair and hollow eyes that stared directly at me. Emily, June, number. This was something else. I could hear faint whispers now, overlapping and chaotic, like a dozen voices speaking at once. They crawled into my ears, burrowing into my brain. One leaves. One stays. The words from the journal repeated in my head, and a cold realization settled into my bones. This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't a simple ghost story. This was a deal that was still unfinished. The flashlight sputtered again, and I caught a glimpse of something sharp in the figure's hand, a jagged fragment of glass or metal. My body screamed at me to move, but the shadows around me were pressing closer now, constricting like vines. My chest felt heavy, and I could barely suck in a breath. Alex, make your choice. My name again. The way it was said made my skin crawl. It was knowing, final, as if it already knew what I would do. I forced my feet to move, staggering backward toward the door. The shadows shifted, pulling toward me like liquid smoke. And I realized I wasn't supposed to leave, not without making a choice. The journal fell from my hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud. The flashlight buzzed one last time before it gave out entirely, plunging me into absolute darkness. And in that darkness, I heard it again. One leaves, one stays. Something brushed against my arm, cold, skeletal fingers, and every nerve in my body lit up in terror. I stumbled backward, fumbling for the door handle, my fingers slick with sweat. When I found it, I yanked it open and threw myself into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. The whispers stopped instantly. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't relief. It wasn't safety. It was waiting. I stood there, chest heaving, my back pressed against the cold door. Somewhere deep in the asylum, I heard it again, that faint, distant giggle. It wasn't over. Not yet. The hallway felt endless. My flashlight was dead. The journal was somewhere on the floor behind me, and my lungs burned as I tried to catch my breath. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run until the asylum was nothing but a smudge in my rearview mirror. But I couldn't. Somewhere deep inside me, a twisted thread of curiosity, or maybe guilt, tugged me back. I needed answers. I needed to understand. The faint giggle echoed again, this time closer. The sound slithered down the corridor like smoke, curling around my ears. A door creaked open to my left, and faint light spilled into the hallway. The light wasn't natural. It was pale, weak, and it flickered like it was gasping for air. The sign above the door read, "Room 369, Twins' Quarters." My pulse thundered in my ears as I stepped inside. The room was small, cramped, and smelled of damp wood and something stale, like the air had been trapped for decades. Two small iron-framed beds stood against opposite walls, their mattresses long rotted away. A single window sat high on the far wall, covered in grime, filtering in pale moonlight. And there, in the middle of the room, stood a single chair. It faced me directly, as if waiting. The whispers started again. Faint at first, like distant radio static, but then they grew louder, closer. I froze. My chest tightened, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The door slammed shut behind me with a thunderous bang. "No, no, no, no!" I spun around, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were growing louder now, overlapping, colliding into an unbearable storm of sound. And then, through the chaos, one voice rose above the rest, clear, deliberate, and trembling with desperation. "Alex, break the silence." It was a child's voice, fragile, but heavy with an urgency that sent chills racing down my spine. I turned back to the room. The chair was now occupied. Two figures sat side by side, their small frames hunched forward, long hair draped like curtains over their hollow faces. Their hands were intertwined, fingers locked together so tightly their knuckles were pale. Emily and June, but they weren't fully there. Their outlines were blurred, flickering like images on an old projector screen, their edges dissolving into shadow. They spoke in unison, their lips barely moving. One leaves, one stays. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my fingers felt numb around the broken flashlight. Who made the deal?" My voice came out cracked, barely louder than a whisper. Emily's head twitched slightly, just enough to indicate her. "She did." June's head turned toward Emily, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. But she couldn't keep the promise. Their voices overlapped again, the sound like glass scraping against stone. The silence wasn't enough. The shadow lady wanted more. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, coiling and unfurling like smoke caught in a breeze. I could feel them creeping closer, inching toward the chair, toward me. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The twins lifted their heads in unison, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. To finish it. To make the choice. The shadows surged forward, and for a split second, I felt something cold, icy cold, brush against my arm. I staggered backward, hitting the door with my shoulder. No, I can't. This isn't my fight," I said, my voice cracking. Emily spoke alone this time, her voice trembling. "One of us needs to leave, Alex. One of us needs to stay, but we can't choose, we can't." June's head snapped toward me. "But you can." The shadows twisted again, pooling on the floor like black ink. The air around me felt heavy, pressing against my chest, my ribs, my lungs. "If you were in my shoes, would you run? Or would you stay and try to set things right?" The words crashed over me like ice water. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, my head in my hands. My brain screamed at me to leave, to run, to break down the door and never look back, but their voices felt like they were clawing at my ribs from the inside. "Please, Alex, please, make it stop." I looked up, tears stinging my eyes. The shadows were almost fully surrounding the twins now, crawling up the chair, pulling at their small, fragile bodies. I had to choose. One leaves, one stays. My voice trembled as I forced the words out. "Emily. Emily can leave." The shadows stilled. June's head twitched violently, and her hollow eyes widened as she let out a strangled sound, a sound that was equal parts relief and agony. Emily's head tilted upward, and a faint light, soft, warm, seemed to rise around her figure. June's body began to sink into the shadows, her form fading like smoke caught in the wind. "Thank you," Emily's voice whispered, faint and soft as morning fog. The room erupted in a deafening crack. The shadows recoiled violently, crashing against the walls before vanishing entirely. I gasped for air, my chest heaving as the icy pressure finally lifted. The chair was empty now. The twins were gone. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was peaceful. For the first time since stepping into Blackwood Asylum, the air felt still. The door creaked open behind me. I stumbled out into the hallway, my legs weak, my mind reeling from what I had just done. The faintest warmth brushed against my cheek, like a child's hand in passing. "Thank you, Alex." Emily's voice, soft, distant, and free. I walked out of Blackwood Asylum as dawn crept over the horizon. The building sat heavy behind me, its secrets buried once again in shadows and silence. But one thing was certain, one of them had been set free, and the other was still there, waiting. The sky was a pale shade of grey as dawn began to creep over the horizon. Weak sunlight bled through the cracked windows of Blackwood Asylum, casting faint streaks of gold and pink across the crumbling walls. My footsteps were uneven as I stumbled through the overgrown courtyard, clutching Emily's journal and the cursed tape recorder tightly against my chest. My flashlight had died long ago, and every shadow felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to turn around. But I didn't look back. The air was cold, biting against my damp clothes, and my breath came out in ragged gasps as I approached my car. The old sedan was parked under a crooked streetlight, its surface slick with rain and condensation. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door, threw the journal and tape onto the passenger seat, and collapsed into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut and locked it, an act that felt foolishly symbolic given what I'd just experienced. For a moment I sat there in silence, my head resting against the steering wheel, my chest rising and falling as I tried to steady my breath. It's over, but it didn't feel over. The car engine coughed to life, and the radio crackled faintly before I switched it off. The silence felt better, less crowded somehow. I pulled out onto the narrow road leading away from the asylum, my headlights cutting through the early morning mist. As the asylum shrank in my rearview mirror, I glanced over at the journal and the tape recorder on the passenger seat. Emily, June, the silent twins. What had I actually encountered back there? Spirits? Residual echoes of their trauma? Or was it something darker? Something born from the fractured promise they made all those years ago? I couldn't shake the image of the two girls seated side by side, their hollow eyes fixed on me, and that voice, the one that whispered my name, the one that made me choose. One leaves, one stays. Had I really helped Emily find peace? Or had I just left one soul trapped forever, bound to those suffocating shadows? The guilt sat heavy in my stomach, a knot I couldn't untangle no matter how hard I tried. The journal sat there, silent and still. But it felt alive, like it was watching me. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The road stretched on, endless and empty. The asylum had long disappeared behind me, but the oppressive weight in my chest hadn't lifted. I cracked the window slightly, letting in the crisp morning air. It felt good against my face, grounding me back into reality, or at least something close to it. But then I heard it. A faint whisper. Alex. My blood turned to ice. It was soft, so soft I could have convinced myself it was just the wind. But it wasn't. It was her. Emily. Or June. Or something else entirely. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a small figure sitting in the back seat, her hollow eyes staring at me. But there was nothing. Just an empty back seat and the faint outline of dawn painting the mist outside. I slammed the window shut and turned the radio back on, letting the garbled static drown out everything else. But the whisper lingered in my head, curling around my thoughts like smoke. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but they'll follow you regardless. I pulled over at a gas station an hour later. My body felt heavy, every muscle aching from tension and exhaustion. As I sat in the driver's seat staring blankly at the horizon, I realized something. I wasn't free. Maybe Emily was. Maybe June was. But I wasn't. Whatever had happened in that asylum, whatever choice I'd made, it had followed me out. I turned to look at the journal and the tape recorder one last time. For a brief second, the thought crossed my mind to toss them both into a trash can, to leave them behind and pretend none of this ever happened. But I couldn't. They were part of me now, a story etched into my bones. I started the car again and pulled back onto the road. The journal sat quietly on the seat beside me, its pages still filled with secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. And somewhere, deep in the quiet corners of my mind, a faint voice still whispered, "One leaves. One stays." The road stretched out ahead of me, endless and uncertain, and the shadows of Blackwood Asylum stretched with it. If this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. And if you've ever experienced something unexplainable, share it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story.